Hello and welcome to my channel. This is Creepy Dread, your storyteller of choice. Before I tell you what the story is about, I would be grateful if you would like and subscribe to the channel so that it can grow. Today I would like to tell you a story about a true urban myth. It's about Hugging Molly, an unknown creature that stalks children on the city streets at night, hugging them fiercely and screeching in their ears. Enough talk, and let's dive in. I wish you a good night. In the small town of Abbeville, Alabama, stories had been circulating for generations about an eerie figure that haunted the streets at night. The residents spoke of Hugging Molly, a ghost that wandered in the darkness and embraced innocent children in the stillness of the night. For many, it was just a scary story used to send children to bed early. But some believed there was more to the legend, that Hugging Molly truly existed and was searching for someone she had lost. Emily Johnson returned to her hometown of Abbeville after many years. After her grandmother's death, she inherited the old house on the outskirts of town. She had spent many summers there as a child, and returning felt like a journey into the past. During her childhood, Emily had heard many stories about Hugging Molly. Her grandmother often told them by the fireplace, while the wind howled through the trees outside. Emily remembered how she would always snuggle under a blanket when the stories became too scary. Now, as an adult, Emily saw things differently. She thought the stories were exaggerated and the town's fear unfounded. Yet deep inside, she felt a slight unease as she entered the old house. It was a chilly autumn evening when Emily moved into her new home. The air was fresh, and the leaves rustled quietly in the wind. She settled into the house and found many mementos from her childhood that reminded her of better times. As darkness fell, Emily decided to take a walk through the town. The streets were quiet, and the full moon bathed everything in a silvery light. She felt nostalgic as she passed by familiar places, yet a part of her was also tense. As she wandered through the alleys, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. The wind blew stronger, and Emily pulled her coat tighter around her. A cold shiver ran down her spine, as if someone were watching her. Back at the house, Emily tried to shake off the eerie feeling. She made herself some tea and sat with a book by the fireplace. The warmth of the flames soothed her, and soon she was engrossed in the story. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. Emily jumped. The noise disrupted the peaceful silence of the house. She set the book aside and went to the door, but when she opened it, there was no one there. Only the wind howled through the trees. Confused and a little nervous, Emily closed the door and returned to the living room. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave her. She decided to go to bed, hoping that a night's sleep would free her from her worries. In the middle of the night, Emily was awakened by a strange sound. It was like the whispering of a woman, soft and haunting. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from outside, right in front of her window. Emily crept to the window and peeked out. In the faint moonlight, she saw a figure standing in the garden. The woman was tall, wrapped in a black cloak, and was looking directly at her. Panic gripped Emily. She drew the curtains and sat back on the bed, gasping. Her mind raced. Was that Hugging Molly? Was the legend true? She tried to calm herself, telling herself it must have been just a dream, but the feeling of apprehension remained. She couldn't close her eyes again for the rest of the night as the wind howled against the house outside. The next morning, Emily was tired and exhausted. She decided to talk to some old acquaintances about the events of the night, hoping to learn more about the legend of Hugging Molly. In a small cafe in town, she met Mrs. Carter, who had lived in Abbeville for decades. Mrs. Carter was known for her stories and tales about the town. "Ah, Emily, back in town, huh?" Mrs. Carter said with a knowing smile as Emily sat down at the table with her. "How's life at the old Johnson house?" Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. I saw something strange last night. A woman in the garden in a black cloak." Mrs. Carter's face grew serious. "Hugging Molly. Many here believe she still wanders around. She's looking for children or for people who remind her of her lost child." Emily swallowed. "Do you believe she really exists?" Mrs. Carter shrugged. "I don't know, but many have spoken of encounters. Be careful, Emily. Emily thanked Mrs. Carter and left the cafe with mixed feelings. She felt watched, as if the whole town knew her story. Nevertheless, she decided not to be controlled by fear. She would find out what was really going on. Back at the house, Emily searched the attic for old family memories. Among the dusty boxes and suitcases, she found an old photo album. She flipped through the yellowed pages and came across a picture that made her pause. It showed her grandmother as a young woman next to another woman in a black cloak. On the back of the photo was written, "Molly and I, summer 1935. Emily couldn't believe it. Was this the famous Hugging Molly? Her hands trembled as she looked more closely at the photo. The woman looked happy, very different from the ghostly figure she had seen at night. Emily knew she had to find out more. She searched the town for clues about the identity of the woman in the photo. In the local library, she finally found an old newspaper article from 1935. The article told the story of a woman named Molly who was inconsolable after the loss of her child. In her grief, she began to roam the town at night, embracing children as if she were searching for her lost son. Some residents thought she was crazy. Others believed she was dangerous. Eventually, she disappeared one night without a trace, and the legend of Hugging Molly began. Emily felt sympathy for Molly, who was trapped in her grief. She now understood that the figure in the garden wasn't evil, but a soul seeking comfort. Following night, Emily decided to face her fear. She sat awake at the window, waiting for the figure to return. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she was determined to learn the truth. Again, she heard the whispering and saw the dark figure in the garden. This time, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The moon cast its light on the woman, who looked at her without moving. "Molly," Emily said softly, taking a step toward the figure. "I know who you are, and I know you're suffering." The figure paused, her movement suddenly halting, as if surprised that someone was speaking to her so directly. Emily could see the woman's face more clearly now. It was old and lined with deep creases, but her eyes were full of sadness. "I'm not here to hurt you," Emily continued. "I want to help you find peace." The figure slowly nodded, as if she understood Emily, and then, without another sound, she vanished into the darkness, back into the shadows of the night. The next morning, Emily found a letter in front of her door. The handwriting was old and shaky, as if written by someone who hadn't practiced in a long time. "Dear Emily," the letter began, "thank you. Your courage has helped me overcome my own fear. I was lost and didn't know how to find my peace. But through you, I've realized I can let go." Emily felt tears in her eyes as she read the letter. She knew that Molly had finally found peace, and that the legend of Hugging Molly now had a new meaning. It was a story of loss and grief, also of redemption and forgiveness. Emily stayed in Abbeville, the old house becoming her new home. The town's residents still talked about the legend of Hugging Molly, but Emily knew the truth behind the story was something different. Molly wasn't a danger, but a soul seeking comfort and understanding. Emily became involved in the community, helping children and families in need, and told Molly's story to promote compassion and understanding. She knew that Molly's spirit had now found rest and that she had grown through her encounter with her. And so, the legend of Hugging Molly became a tale no longer associated with fear and horror, but with the hope of healing and peace.